Hey guys, it's Aaron again. This will be the second little talk that given for this Costa Rica class this year, um, entitled Botany Basics. Last class it was kind of the bullet points and some of the more eye-catching things that you expect to see on the trip. Um, this talk will be kind of broken up into two parts where I'll give you a background on some botanical classifications. So we'll go over the big bullet points on how plants are broken down into various subgroups to kind of break it apart for you. And then the second part is going to be some of the high points I want to talk about actually identifying plants in the field. So both will be a bit of a brief overview for both of those topics, but I think we're going to cover some things you guys are going to like. So first of all, what is a plant? Um, so like a lot of things in the scientific world, there isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule, but rather a series of common traits that all plants must adhere to be considered a plant. And we'll go over some of those real quick. They're multicellular um, eukaryotes, and if we haven't gone over this in any of your biology courses, eukaryotes are organisms with a membrane-bound nucleus. So the defining characteristics of eukaryotes, aside from prokaryotes, is the nucleus is going to be contained within a membrane, as are the other organelles within the cell. Prokaryotes are older, more rudimentary form of organisms where everything's just kind of floating around in there. Um, Most plants are capable of photosynthesis, so they contain these chloroplasts and chlorophylls, which help enable photosynthesis. And as I'm sure all of you know, photosynthesis is the process of taking sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and creating energy. There are some plants that do not engage in photosynthesis, and these are, you know, either rely on the relationship of a fungi or a fungus, or they are things like members of the Orbanchiaceae family that are parasitic or hemiparasitic. Think ghost pipe in the woods. It's this little thing that pops out of the ground, kind of looks like a pipe, and it's totally white. It doesn't need to be green from the chlorophyll because it doesn't engage in photosynthesis. Some other parasitic plants, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but oh, there's a bunch of orchids in the coral root genus, Chlorrhiza. They are non-photosynthetic. Another common trait is these cells are contained in a cell wall that is made up of cellulose. In your Bio 101 and 102 courses, they're going to be hammering that point home pretty hard, that on a cellular level, that's one thing that separates plants from animals. You know, plants don't really rely on a skeletal structure. So cell wall is a common trait that all plants share. And another kind of more narrative based and more subjective, loose criteria is that plants are relatively stationary. They don't move around like a mammal or, you know, any other type of organism. So that's what a plant is. So when we talk about plants, whether it be, you know, in classes or, you know, if you get jobs out in the field in the future, chances are pretty good we're talking about vascular plants. We won't be talking about things like algae or mosses or liverworts, um, or lichens. Those things are still considered to be in the plant kingdom, but they do not have these vascular bundles of xylem and phloem that are used to transport water and nutrients throughout the plants. Those are non-vascular plants, and they have their own thing going on. They have other organelles and different mechanisms for transporting nutrients. But what we're talking about is vascular plants, and they can be broken up into three main categories. First being pteridophytes, and they were the first to evolve these vascular bundles, and they'll be, think of them as the ferns and others. So they're the ferns and fern-like plants, including lycophytes, which are your ground pines, or Lycopodium, diphasiastrums, all those, they all the pteridophytes reproduce via spores. That's one common trait. Horsetails, horsetail equisetum is a genus that we actually have here, and then ferns as a whole, which are more diverse than these two. So think ferns, and they used to call them fern allies. We'll go with that. The next is going to be the gymnosperms, and that means naked seed. So they don't have what's called an endocarp surrounding the, or they don't have a fruity structure surrounding the endocarp. So these will be pines, spruces, all your conifers, your cycads, which are mainly in the tropics, and they have cones, and we'll bring up pictures here in a minute. Ginkgos, which is a broadleaf tree, I believe from East Asia, Ginkgo biloba, which is also how I remember gymnosperms being the naked seeds. I think gymnosperms, ginkgo. And then I remember angiosperms basically meaning all else, because it refers to all flowering plants. But getting back to the gymnosperms, so the big thing with them is they don't have a fruit surrounding their seeds. They rely off of reproducing via male and female cones rather than flowers, but we'll get into that in a minute. Then angiosperms, which I just mentioned, which are the flowering plants, and they will have a fruit surrounding their seed. These are pretty much everything, everything that I just didn't name. So everything from grasses to, your pretty flowers in your house, or the fruit you pick up at the store. Yeah. Here's a little illustration, kind of what I just described, but it's on an evolutionary timeline. So we have the development of chloroplasts in organisms, and for a long time these were kind of restricted to your green algae, and then you can see liverworts, honeworts, and mosses are before the break, where we have this common trait of xylem and phloem. So everything after this point will be your vascular plants. So like we talked about, we have your pteridophytes up here, your gymnosperms with the cycads, ginkgos, and conifers, and then lastly we have your monocots and dicots, or some people call eudicots, with your angiosperms. Good little visual representation with kind of evolutionary time. Here we have a couple images of some common pteridophytes that you might see down in Costa Rica, as well as a handy little just drawing. As discussed before, we have the ferns, the horsetails, Selaginella, which we don't have any in this region, but we will have some in Costa Rica, and then Azolla, which is an aquatic fern group. Here we have Microgramma, which is an epiphytic genus of fern. We have tree ferns down in Costa Rica, which I always go crazy for, because to me it's just mind-boggling that you have this pteridophyte that has undergone this convergent evolution to develop woody tissue, much like the broadleaf trees and gymnosperms later does. But they are in the Cyatheaceae family, and they're just pretty breathtaking in my opinion. Most ferns, if you have a fertile frond, as they're called, you can flip them over and usually see these sori, and they contain the sporangia, which is how these things will wind up reproducing, which we'll get into in a minute. But these are definitely diagnostic characteristics, both with species that are in Costa Rica, and if you're walking in the woods around here trying to ID ferns, a lot of times you can gain a lot of information with the structures of these sori. And like I said, they're packed with spores, either immature, or when they're ripened they'll look a little darker or browner, usually sometimes red. And like I said earlier, this is a Selaginella. It's a genus of pteridophyte down in Costa Rica that we will see growing along the forest floor. So I had written on that last slide, I didn't actually vocalize it, but one thing that all pteridophytes have in common is their life cycle, and they have a pretty unique one as opposed to flowering plants. So they have a two-stage life cycle, and I'll just kind of gloss over it real quick, but you can see down here we have haploid and diploid. So diploid will be two sets of chromosomes, like all of our body cells, and then haploid will be, think, half. It's only one set, and that's much like our gametes, our sperm and egg cells. They only have one set. They're not complete yet. So let's start from baseline, what we most see in the woods. We have this fully mature fern, and this is what's called the sporadophyte stage of its life. And it lives and it matures and it becomes sexually mature, and it grows those sporangia like I showed you in the last slide, and they will release these spores here, which are haploid as discussed. So these spores will land on the ground and they will each grow into this gametophyte if it's successful. And these gametophytes aren't the new version of this quite yet. The gametophyte is something that pretty much exists. It has these little rhizoid roots. It can bring up moisture and photosynthesize, and it has its own little life cycle, but it won't grow into this. Its whole purpose is to create these gametes that will fertilize one another and then create a new sporadophyte. So like I said, these are all haploid, and then you get a male cell comes in contact with a female cell, much like pollen and eggs, but that is what yields fertilization and forms a zygote, and then will develop into your adult fern as discussed previously. So it's a little different. It still has fertilization, but really the big difference is this whole life cycle up here, which isn't, when an egg gets fertilized in the other plants, it just grows into a new plant, where we have this kind of other alternating step for pteridophytes, which I think is pretty interesting. Here's a couple images of some gymnosperms we might run into down there. Over here on the left, or on the right rather, these will look pretty familiar. This is a Caribbean pine, and this is on the property, but you can see it has a cone structure very similar to the pines up here. And remember that these create seeds that do not have a fruit surrounding them, and they reproduce via these male and female cones. The male cones will usually be a little smaller. The female cones will be a little larger. And then we have here this species of Zamia, which is pretty cool. This is a female, so this is the female cone, and it is actually going into, I guess, seed. I guess we wouldn't say going into fruit because it doesn't really have a fruit. Another aspect of gymnosperms that differs from angiosperms, they're usually wind pollinated. So they don't typically have an attractant mechanism like pretty flowers to draw in a pollinator. It largely relies on wind to pollinate. That's not to say that necessarily all angiosperms rely on a pollinator. There's certainly some that rely on wind pollination. So angiosperms, we have this seed that's enclosed in an ovary and usually a fruit surrounding that. It reproduces via flowers, and the flower is always, has a stigma and a stamen, which we're going to get into in a moment. Variety of pollination methods, like I discussed earlier. Here's some examples of, just a pretty flower. It's a hibiscus that we'll see down there. This fruit is one of a ficus. I'm unsure of what the species is, but you can see all of these little seeds that are encapsulated in this larger fruit. So all of these seeds developed as a result of the flower being pollinated. Same with this jungle cucumber, which is a member of the cucumber family, but this is its fruit. I've kind of, with my knife, kind of cut it open. Didn't get a great angle showing the seeds within it, but flowering plants producing fruits covering the seeds. So angiosperms can be broken up into a couple different categories, monocots and dicots. And they, kind of like what I was talking about earlier with the definition of a plant, they kind of subscribe to a couple different set of rules to describe whether or not they're in the monocots or dicots. The main thing is a cotyledon leaf is the first leaf that the newly germinated seed will produce. Monocots produce one leaf, whereas dicots will produce two. Now, monocots evolved from dicots, so it's not as if monocots are more rudimentary or simpler plants or less evolved. It's just a different way of doing things, and this is a familial lineage. So we have one cotyledon leaf, we have parallel venation generally. There are some with netted veins, but that's not the common vein. The rootstock thing, I've seen it both, but by and large, we have tap roots for dicots and more horizontal rootstocks in monocots. Monocots definitely are more simple branching, whereas dicots, because of the way their xylem and phloem are situated within the stem, actually can lead to more complex branching. So think like a tree, you have a lot of branches coming off, and then you think of a grass stalk, because grasses are monocots, and most trees, with the exception of palm trees and bamboo, are dicots. Floral parts in monocots, generally speaking, are going to be in values of threes or sixes, and then floral parts in dicots will be 4s and 5s and others. So when I say floral parts, I usually am talking about the petals and sepals, which we're going to get into all that stuff here in a minute. So some examples of monocots: we got grasses, we've got orchids, lilies, spiderworts, the entire ginger family, which is going to be big in Costa Rica, which we'll talk about, as with the banana family as well. Irises, pondweeds, bromeliads. So these are all things, when you think about them, okay, parallel leaf venation. And we have floral parts in threes. One cotyledon leaf. You're not going to see too many newly germinated seeds on the ground. So, but some examples of dicots, which is probably the more diverse of the two groups. Think sunflowers, mints, roses, mustards, milkweeds, oak trees, maple trees, most things that I didn't describe here, because I kind of racked my brain for a lot of monocots, and I think I got most of them, at least most of the common ones. Here we have some imagery to kind of talk about, or to represent what we just went over in the previous slide. There aren't leaves coming out of these seeds, but if this monocot was germinating, it would just have one, whereas this dicot would have one and then another right next to it. We kind of talked about the roots, which I kind of glossed over it because I find that to be a little inconsistent. You definitely can have big rhizomy tap roots in monocots, and you can have fibrous roots in dicots. So I didn't want to really get into those confusion points, but more reliably, we have the leaf venation. You can see this almost looks like a grass-like leaf, and it's got parallel venation. You can see here running parallel to the midrib, whereas in this maple leaf, we have veins that are coming out and are branching out, covering the whole leaf. And that'll be a pretty consistent thing between monocots and dicots that you can pay attention to. Another interesting thing is just the way that their xylem and phloem are situated within the stems. So in monocots, the vascular bundles are going to be more scattered, whereas in dicots, they form a nice little ring. So think of like a ring on a tree. We kind of talked about these flower parts. Now in lilies, which this is a lily, you have the petals and sepals that are identical to each other. So this is a three-parted flower. You've got three sepals here, and you've got three petals here, but because it's a lily, they are indistinguishable from each other. And then you have something in the mallow family, or like a hibiscus, that has a five-parted flower. Here's some examples of monocots versus dicots, just to kind of piggyback what I was talking about with branching. We have some pretty complex branching on this Cecropia tree. We talked about Cecropias in the last talk with the Azteca ants. Here's a cool plant. If you guys are familiar with milkweeds up here, we have a tropical milkweed that is native to Costa Rica. We have a composite flower, so we have ray flowers and disc flowers within the same, which we'll go over in a minute. We got a passion flower down here. We have a melastome. It's a Meconia. And then on the dicot or the monocot side of things, we have aroids. This is a species of Monstera. This is a young coconut coming out of its seed. We've got a couple orchids here, Maxillaria and Encyclia. So if you'll notice on this Encyclia or Prostechia, whichever you want to go with, we have, you can see 6 structures coming out of them, and 3 of them are going to be sepals and 3 of them are going to be petals. We have a lip here. We kind of talked about orchid flower arrangement earlier. And then we have a swamp lily down here. Oh yeah, and a little prayer plant. So there's a little visual representation. I know it's kind of hard to get into with just a couple pictures, but this is something we're going to talk, and all these things we're going to talk about while we're on the trail. So we're gonna get caught up. This is a nice representation of just how things all fit together. So we talked about non-vascular plants real quick. So we've got ancestral green algae coming up into the other non-vasculars, to these mosses and liverworts. And then we have the xylem and phloem break, where we have pteridophytes coming into the mix here. And then as we move on the tree of life, we have gymnosperms evolving. And then this great big part of the tree is the angiosperms. And from that we have dicots evolving, and then monocots branching off of that, and both going their separate ways to speciate. So real quickly, I wanted to just gloss over this point real quick of just taxonomy and scientific nomenclature. So we operate under the Linnaeus system from the 1750s, where we use Latin names with a scientific names are 2 names, a genus and a species. So here we have Helianthus annuus, which is common sunflower, and its genus up here will be Helianthus. The species name, how it's differentiated between other members within the same genus, it will be the epithet, which is the species name. You can go up higher on the ladder to kind of ascertain how this is broken down further and where in the evolutionary tree it belongs. Family is going to be a lot of the things that, or it's going to be a main talking point of mine because I like to break things up into family. It helps things make sense. One thing I want to point out is with plants, families are always suffixed with ACA. So we have Asteraceae, Orchidaceae. This is going to be the suffix for families. And I don't know if you guys have made it there with any biology courses, but with things like mammals or you know, other animals, family is suffixed with ide, I-D-A-E. So like, just off the top of my head, you've got Muscidae, you've got, I mean, I'm on the spot, but Canidae for the dog family, Felidae, the cat family, and so on. But plants use this this suffix, and then order, alles. There's a rhyme or reason to this, but for now we'll kind of focus on the families and then the genus and species. I just wanted to go over that real quick, so no one would. Okay, botany basics. So at this point, we're going to talk about some diagnostic characteristics, some physiology of plants, and what to look at when you're trying to identify plants, because it can be overwhelming because there's so much diversity in the plant world that you might not, you know, be able to tell one thing from another unless you get a lot of repetitions in. It's not like looking at a cat versus a dog and knowing that, okay, well, I'm familiar enough with what a cat looks like and I know it's not a dog, that kind of thing. But botany is kind of interesting. There's some plus sides and some minus sides to trying to ID plants. On the plus side, they don't run away from you. So you can really sit with a plant and really kind of get to know it and try to figure it out. On the downside is what you see is what you get. You can't necessarily, if you have an immature plant or if you have a plant that's gone to fruit and you know it more from the flower, kind of have to take all these little puzzle pieces and put them together, and that's where a lot of resources come into. So we've got some, you know, plus sides. They don't run away, but we've also got some challenge aspects because you can't always control what stage of development they're in. But some key things that we're going to look for when we're identifying plants are listed here. We got the flower, we've got fruits, we've got within those fruits we have seeds. Leaves can tell you a lot. The characteristics of the stem and bark can tell you a lot. It really just depends on what kind of species you're looking at. You can even tell a lot from the roots. There's plenty of species up here in our region that look very similar to one another, but one's a perennial species with roots that overwinter and the same plant comes back, and there's other with just little thin fibrous roots and they only persist for one season. There's also specialized structures that we can start paying attention to, like thorns or hairs, or even some different plant families, kind of like what we discussed with orchids and aroids. So their flower structure is going to be totally different from those of other plants. So maybe if you have an orchid flower, you can tell right away that it's an orchid. Another thing we want to kind of pay attention to is habitat. And this is kind of going to be one of those things that you're going to pay more attention to once you've got a nice Rolodex of plants to choose from in your head. It's like, well, this can be this or this, but I'm near a river, so it's probably going to be this. It can be an important piece of information for you. Another aspect that I want you guys to think about when you're trying to identify plants is just the general grouping. So, and this is going to be a little bit easier than the more technical stuff. Am I looking at a tree? Is it going to be a shrub? And one way you can tell trees from shrubs, generally speaking, particularly in our region, is that, if it's a small little bushy thing that has reached sexual maturity, so it's producing flowers, it's going to be probably classified as a shrub because trees usually grow to a certain height before they can start reproducing. Is it herbaceous, meaning it doesn't create that woody tissue? Graminoids are going to be things like grasses and sedges, all monocots. Ferns, we've already gone over some of the diagnostic characteristics of them. Is it succulent? That's not necessarily defined by a particular family, but rather just the way um, the leaf and stem structures are, usually, dictated by climate in very dry places. Is it a vine? Down here we have things called lianas, excuse me, and that's going to be a woody vine, and you also have herbaceous vines. Or is it an aquatic plant? So that's something I check off my list real quick when I'm looking at a plant. I just throw it into one of these categories because it helps my brain just think a little bit more clearly and quickly. So what do I look at first when I'm identifying a plant? I can tell you what I do, but I want you guys to figure out what works best for you. And it might take you a minute, but this is hopefully going to be maybe the start of a long journey with you digging on plants. So I already kind of talked about real quick what the plant type was. I usually check that off my list real quick. And then me personally, one of the first things I look at is the leaf arrangement. And we're going to go over that in a second. But how are these leaves arranged? So these ones are opposite to one another, two coming out of the same node. Now, if there was just one leaf here and nothing here, and then another leaf here, that would be called alternate. Like I said, we're going to talk about that more in a second. And quickly after that, I usually just give the leaf a quick glance. So does it have a tooth margin? What do the veins look like? Is it going to be hairy? Is it going to be smooth? Then I look at the flower. Kind of look at these two, maybe equal weight bared on them, because the flower can tell you a whole lot more than the leaf. I check out the flower, what the structure is, and then finally I'm going to look at the habitat type. So that's kind of my hierarchy. I don't tell you this so that you guys do this. I hope that you guys figure out your own way of figuring out what different plants are. I'm just kind of telling you what my brain goes through when I look at something new, and maybe it'll be helpful, maybe not. So here we have some diagrams of just a basic stem and then a twig. I mainly show you this to point out that a lot of times you'll have different points of growth on a plant. You'll have this apical meristem, which is responsible for growth upwards, and you'll also have one within the root. But then you have also these axillary growths, and some plants, they'll grow up and just have a stalk with some lateral branchings, and that's it. Others, they'll have this axillary growth, which will then in some cases produce flowers. So sometimes that's really important, is where the flowers are coming from. Are they just terminal, or are they just axillary, coming out of these axillary buds? Typically in the plant world, if you have a leaf at what's called a node site, right here, you will also have a bud right above it, and that's an opportunity for this plant to grow out. So a lot of times if you have an injury to a plant where this terminal bud gets chopped off, this will become the new terminal bud. All the hormones of the plant will now say that this is the primary place for vertical growth. So I wanted to get a little vocabulary out of the way for you guys. So we just went over buds. This is where next year's growth is going to come from, usually situated right up on top of a leaf. This is where a leaf site is. We're talking leaf scars here because just for sake of the diagram, the leaves aren't included. But these are called nodes. And then everything in between will be called an internode right here. So when I talk about look at the node site or look at the internode, I just want you guys to have a little Rolodex of vocabulary words, which this portion of the lecture is going to be full of, and hopefully not overwhelming. But the main reason I wanted to show you this plant was to hammer in your head that there can be flowering sites at both the terminus and then these axillary sites, and sometimes that's pretty important in diagnosing what a particular species is. So we touched on leaves just a moment ago. I say that's one of the first things I look at. Right here is leaf arrangement. Now I touched on it real quickly, but I'm going to show you now that I have some pictures in front of us. We have a couple different types here. We have alternate. So Remember what these are? These are the node sites with the buds and the leaf coming out. So this is going to be called an alternate arrangement. That means you have one leaf and one bud site coming out at each node. You have one here, and they'll often be what's the word? Oh, well, alternating. One will go right, one will go left, one will go right, one will go left. That is going to be alternate leaf arrangement. And then you'll have something called opposite leaf arrangement, where at each node site you're going to have two. You're going to have two leaf sites, and you're going to have two corresponding bud sites right above them. And they come out opposite of each other, as the name implies, but you'll have a set here, and then you'll go up, spanning the inner node to the next node, and then you'll have two more. And these two are very common. And like I said, usually when I grab a plant, that's one of the first things I look at, particularly for our region, because that's just how I learned, and I know plants A, B, C are opposite, and plants, X, Y, Z are alternate, and I can, just based on that, I can filter out half of those plants. I just don't even have to think about them. Some other, maybe, I don't want to say they're uncommon because there's nothing particular amazing about them, but less commonly seen is a world where you have 3 or more leaves at a particular node site. So think like Joe Pye weed, if you're familiar. That's a world leaf, but it won't be opposite, because to be opposite you need just 2 of something, and it's not alternate because each node looks like this, world. And then you have basal, and this is when you just have leaves at the ground level. So this stem, obviously the diagram isn't going to show it, but it goes up and continues, and there may or may not be what are called colline leaves going up the stem up here. So this is the basal leaf arrangement. While we're talking about leaves and the great big picture, I'm going to jump down here and we're going to talk about leaf types real quick, because this is another thing that, like, real quick it just jumps out at you. Is the leaf simple or is the leaf compound? And this can further filter out possibilities in your head of what a certain plant can be, because it will have one or the other. So with simple leaves, we have a petiole, and that's what attaches the leaf to the plant, and you have one structure attached to that petiole. This is the entire leaf. This one's particularly lobed, this one's entire, and this is what you see is what you get. This is the entire thing. So think oaks and maples and things like that. And then we jump over here to something called a compound leaf. And we have the same thing where the petiole comes up, and then whether or not you want to get into the nitty-gritty of things, but it produces this rachis with a lot of different leaflets coming off of them. So each of these little black dots on these diagrams are not leaves within themselves. This entire thing is a leaf, this entire thing is a leaf, and so on. These little individual bodies are called leaflets, and it's a smaller part of the greater leaf. So we have 2 types of compound leaves. We have this one, which is a palmate compound leaf. Just think, hold your hand out in front of you, your palm, all your fingers kind of, more or less come out of a central point, and it looks like a palm. And then we have pinnately compound. So the first thing I think of when I think of a pinnately compound leaf is it kind of looks like a fern frond, and those little leaves on ferns are called pinnae, so that might be a good way of remembering it. So black walnuts, ash, hickories, tree of heaven, these will all have a pinnately compound leaf. And I didn't go over any palmate, so buckeye would be a good example. A cannabis leaf will be a palmately compound. And then further, you can break this down into bipinnately compound, meaning each of these side shoots is also a compound structure. This is still all just one leaf, but it's just further separated into that pinnate structure. So now that we talked about leaves a little bit, I'm not going to go over all of these just for the sake of time. I don't want to keep you here for too long, but just observe basic leaf shapes. So we can have narrow leaves, we can have wide leaves, we can have leaves that are more intermediate, where you have a wide base kind of coming down into a narrow point that's going to be ovate. There's going to be a lot of ovate leaves, especially with the drip tips that we were talking about in the last slide. We have obovate, where it's kind of the inverse, where you have a narrow base coming to an apex that's rather fat. And in wide leaves, it's going to be more of a description of the overall shape. So we have chordate, so heart-shaped. We have lobes coming out. So a lot of your aroids, or your philodendrons and your monsteras, will have really chordate leaf structures. Reniform, you can think of the renal system. What does that look like? That looks like a kidney. So reniform, we got a little Latin class going here. And then we have our narrow leaves, which you can tell we kind of borrowed our ob prefix here with the oblanceolate. We have lanceolate. The way I think of lanceolate is a lance or a spear. It's kind of spear tipped. And then we just have a linear leaf. Building off of that, you can tell a lot. Once you get into a genus, you might have leaves that look really similar at a glance, but then when you start looking at them a little bit harder, you're noticing that maybe the leaf margins are different. And we can have everything from entire to undulate, which is more or less entire, but it's kind of got this wavy, crisped kind of design to it. And then within the toothed category, we have serrate, doubly serrate, where each serration has other serrations on them. And then this crenate, which is more of kind of a loby structure, more convex in the undulations. And then you have lobed, so think of like a white oak. A white oak has these lobed margins, and maybe to the untrained eye or somebody that's not familiar with it, you might assume that it's a compound leaf because they're so lobed and emarginated, but in reality it's just a single leaf structure because there is tissue right here, and it's not just a bare rachis going through. If any of you guys have any questions, I know I'm going to be going over a lot of stuff on this talk. Feel free to shoot me an email, or when we get in the woods down there, feel free to talk my ear off. I like talking about plants. So similarly to the leaf margin, we can further categorize these leaf tips and then leaf bases with vocabulary to help us describe things. And I'm not going to get bogged down in the vocabulary. Like if you go out into the field and you're taking notes on a plant, and it's like, well, the leaf base was really constricted and then it went out going towards the apex. It's like, well, as long as you can be really descriptive and know what you meant, I'm all for it. I'm just presenting you with the information of some terminology here, and I don't expect you guys to memorize any of this, because half the stuff is stuff I have to look up the definition to, because botanists have this tricky habit of usually giving a name to something and then confounding the topic by giving 2 additional names to describe the same thing. I really don't like it, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. But we have acuminate, basically means pointy. Acute, a little less pointy. We can break them down into the minutia, but as long as you guys know that the vocabulary is out there, and if you want to latch on to a couple different things, like mucronate. Mucronate doesn't mean anything else other than what it is, which is wide and then quickly tapering down into a small point. so that you can tell how mucronate is different than acuminate. And you might be able to just, just write that down in your notes without using either of these vocabulary words. But as you progress in your professional scientific career, you'll just find yourself picking up on these things. So similarly with these bases, we already kind of talked about a chordate leaf base, meaning heart shape. So we got lobes coming out here. Now, if you take those lobes and you maybe exaggerate them a little bit more, you have hostate and auriculate. So basically, when auriculate, I think of little ears, and then hostate, I think of more of a spear shape. And then truncate means, when you truncate something, you cut it off. So it almost looks like the base of this leaf was truncated, and it is very abruptly ending. Sagittate is, these are all just kind of different shades of gray to the untrained eye, but sagittate will be kind of something in between hostate and chordate. Of course, we have rounded. One thing I want to take some time and point out is this oblique leaf base, because there are certain plants here in these woods. We have a lot of our elm species, so slippery elm and American elm, as well as hackberry. They have an oblique leaf base, and that's a really, fairly unique. Not everything has it, but it's like a dead giveaway. And then down here in the tropics, a lot of the begonias will have an oblique leaf base, as well will some members of the Piper genus. So I just want to preload you guys with some vocabulary words. Like I said, I don't want you guys to get overwhelmed, but just know they're out there. And I'll put these PDFs up somewhere on the share drive so you guys can refer to them. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I can point you into some directions of some good glossaries. Any good botany book that you have will have a glossary in the back that will define this plethora of vocabulary words for you. Another important aspect, and I usually peek in at this whenever I kind of assess whether or not the leaf is going to be an alternate or opposite or world arrangement, is basically the connection point of the leaf to the twig or stem. And the main ones that we'll see and probably talk about is this petiolate and then sessile. So petiolate, as you would guess, there is a petiole. And a lot of these other ones are petiolate. Well, just this one, I guess. But there's a little petiole, so meaning there's a little gap, this structure between the solar panel of the leaf and the stem of the plant. And this is called the petiole. It's the connection point. Now, with sessile leaves, this petiole will be either non-existent or be limited to about 1 millimeter. For all intents and purposes, it's not there. You can tell, you can differentiate species based on this alone in some instances. Moving on, we have a sheathing habit where at the node, which is actually down here, we have a sheath that comes up, and then it branches into your petiole and into your greater leaf further downstream. So this part right here is called the sheath. And it's a little bit different than your petiolate because of this feature. Decurrent, don't see this too much, but basically you have this opposite leaf arrangement. The leaves kind of touch here for a little bit. They are two separate structures, and then they break away to go their separate ways. These two are very similar, where you have basically, I like to call this clasping, which is fine, and a lot of books call it clasping too. But you basically have these little ears that continue. So you've got your node right here, your leaf attachment right here where my dot is, and then the leaf continues in the other direction to get a little bit more real estate before coming out here with the main body of the leaf. I call this clasping usually. And then perfoliate is similar, but it actually will fuse around. So this is bone set is one with a perfoliate leaf structure, which it is oppositely arranged. So you basically have two leaves that come off in this one part, but they're connected. Um, which, all right, yeah, I just messed that up. That's perfoliate, like this. Um, but yeah, I just described it over here. So yes. So the way the leaf attached is often important. And I know we're going over a lot of this stuff and it might be boring, but this will all work into your Rolodex of things that you just innately look at when you describe a species. So this is a helpful diagram. It goes over some of the things we just talked about with the petiole coming here and then continuing on into the rachis on compound leaves, and it's just called a vein, which is the midvein on simple leaves. And then you have the leaf margin, the veins. This is called the lamina, which is actually the Spanish word for blade as well. So if you're ever looking at a Spanish key, that'll be helpful for you. One of the main reasons I included this slide is because I find this part really helpful. Because so many times, you're reading a scientific resource and they assume that you know these words, and you'll see proximal and distal all the time, and it's really helpful for me to see a visualization. So think distal, that's the far end of the structure, it's most distant, and that's the way I think of it. And then you have the proximal, it's closest. Abaxial is the lower portion or the lower surface of the leaf, and then adaxial is the upper surface. You can say lower surface, upper surface, that's fine, but a research material that you might be referencing says abaxial and adaxial. The way I remember that is if I were to lay the B and the D on top of this line, their bellies would both be facing out. So below is abaxial, above is that adaxial, because that D faces up. But just trying to preload you guys with some vocabulary words. So another important thing in plant identification is going to be describing the surfaces of mainly leaves, but oftentimes you might have a species that it talks about the surface of the bud or the stem if it's an herbaceous plant. So knowing some of these terms, is going to be pretty important. I won't go into each one in detail. On the next slide, they are spelled out. I define them for you there. So I'm just going to touch on some of them quickly and kind of imprint on you guys the importance of it, because there are little minute differences. Now, first of all, they don't show one of just a smooth surface. So let's pretend that's up here, and that'll be called glabrous. That means there's no hairs on it, and these hairs are actually modified trichomes. And a lot of times a plant might be hairy, particularly on the leaf underside, because that's where a lot of the respiration of the plant takes place. So they're giving off oxygen and water. Particularly in drier places, you might encounter fuzzier plants. Or you think of oak species, a lot of times their undersides of their leaves are fuzzy. And what that is an adaptation to is trying to retain moisture in that transpiration process, because the plant doesn't want to give up excess moisture if it doesn't have to. Regardless, even in the tropics, you'll have a lot of surfaces that are fuzzy with these trichomes. So to go over a few of them, pubescent, you're going to have short, not stiff hairs. They're not going to be appressed to the leaf like this one or this one or this one. They're going to be standing straight up. You have tomentose, and to me that means more fuzzy. You've got kind of hairs going in all different directions. They're a little bit more tightly packed. Villose is going to be more implicit of longer, wispier hairs. Going down here, we've got pilose. We've got long wispies that aren't quite as packed together. Arachnos, so think arachnid. So these are kind of just cobwebby structures that are very oppressed to the surface, whether it be leaf or stem. Scabrous is another one I want to highlight because you might not even, when you're touching a leaf and it's scabrous, you might not even recognize it, your brain might not, as hairs, because it just feels rough. And that's what scabrous is, that kind of rough feeling. And when I think of maybe an elm, an elm leaf is kind of rough. There are plenty of other examples. Basically, if you were going to take a leaf off and rub it against your cheek or your lip or like a sensitive area and it kind of feels, not good, it's like, well, that's going to be more scabrous. Hispid, you've got more stiff hairs that aren't going to be as pliable. They might even poke you. Strygos is going to be more stiff, longish hairs that are pressed to the surface. Again, not going to go over all of these, but I did want to kind of highlight the fact, like I said, it's this pesky habit that botanists have of describing something in such minutia that it actually breaks it into different words, which can be incredibly helpful if you're out in the field and you're looking at hairs and you're like, well, I know that this is fuzzy, but it's not pubescent. It's definitely more pilose because look how long these hairs are. So it can be really helpful provided you have a book that describes these things for you, like a glossary, until you get them beat into your brain. So as I said on the previous slide, I have these actually defined for you just because I do find them to be interesting and a good example of breaking down the little details on why things are described a certain way. I'm not going to go through these all. I just went over a couple. But one thing I did want to point out is this tendency in botany language to suffix something with this ululant, so pubescent as opposed to puberulent or tomentose or tomentulose. So that's just saying that it's minutely whatever the root word is. So it's not quite tomentose, it's almost, it's tomentulose. Which can get a little confusing, but this is here for your future reference. When we're out in the field, I have a feeling that, whenever we're talking about diagnostics, I'm just going to say, hey, is it fuzzy or not? And that'll kind of be your gateway drug into thinking about these things in a little bit more detail as you move forward in your careers. So let's put it all together real quick and just talk about some of these leaves, and maybe you guys can think about brainstorming on how you would describe them if you were to encounter them and maybe had an assignment that Ammo said, hey, I would like for you guys to describe these plants. So starting up here, this is a plant that I have not keyed out, but I do know based on the venation and the little hairs that you can't really see in the slide. Well, you can see them up here. But this subparallel venation, this ladder effect, you've got these parallel veins going along, parallel almost to the midrib of the vein, and then these lateral veins kind of laddering up to it. This is dead giveaway the Melastomaceae family, the melastome family. Very diverse in the tropics, but it just is a little, it's almost like a cheat code. It's like, well, I know that this is a familial trait of the Melastomaceae family, so bam, you've already narrowed it down by a huge percentage. And that's just because we know that melastomes have this subparallel venation and are often, well, let's call this, it's either pilose or hispid. Pipers. So a lot of times with pipers, I'm going to throw a couple things at you real quick. Look at the leaf base. So we have a really cordate leaf base on this one on the bottom. In fact, this ear on the left overlaps this ear. That's, if you ever look at piper keys, that's actually quite important. Whereas this one, it still is lobed. It's a little cordate. It might even be a little oblique since this one kind of goes up a little bit more than this one. These are diagnostic characteristics that if you're really dead set on identifying something, you're going to want to have notes on. And to be honest with you, in years past, I haven't known enough about these species to know that to write it down. Luckily, I had some pictures that could help me out a little bit after the fact. Another thing that you might want to pay attention to is how many lateral veins there are. Sometimes you'll get to a species description and you'll think it's it, but then you'll read in the description that it's got 12 to 18 lateral veins, and then you're looking at this leaf and it's like, man, I hope I looked at more than one leaf. This could just be a young leaf. I'm not sure that that's it. So we're just stacking knowledge on top of knowledge, and but just trying to give you guys some examples of things to look for. With this one, what kind of leaf do we have here? We have this center rachis with different leaflets coming off laterally. So this is going to be a compound leaf. It's going to be a pinnately compound leaf because it doesn't look like the palm of your hand. In fact, it's going to be bipinnately compound because each of these little leaflets is comprised of these little things going this way. You can kind of see it more in this little frame right here. So it's not only compound once, but twice. And this is Pentaclethra macroloba. We touched on this species being kind of a main canopy species at the station that undergoes that movement based on absence of sunlight. So these leaves will actually close up. On this anthurium, one thing I wanted to point it out with it is just look at the texture. You've got these raised surfaces. It almost looks bubbly to a certain extent. And that's how I wound up, and I think me and Justin figured out this plant independent of each other because of this feature. And it can be helpful. Going down here, we have a begonia semiovata, as I kind of talked about earlier. So they're going to have pretty distinctly oblique leaf bases. You can tell that this lobe of the leaf is much wider than this one, and that's a familial trait of the Begoniaceae family. Moving over with this lantana, what can we tell about the name here? Trifolia. 1, 2, 3. So you may not be able to tell unless you zoom in, if you guys can zoom in once I print this out for you, but these 3 leaves come out at the same node. So these are actually a whorled set of leaves. And this one's a little bit more clear because you can see a petiole here and a petiole here. So this is a group of whorled leaves, and then there's another group right here. And that is diagnostic in this species, Lantana trifolia. I included this piper here because it's got an interesting leaf attachment. So you've got this adaxial or top leaf surface, and where's the petiole come in? Well, the petiole comes in completely underneath, and this whole leaf surface is kind of fused together almost like a lily pad, and that'll be indicative of this Piper peldatum species. Now there's another piper down there because the tropics are so diverse that looks pretty much exactly like this one, except the leaf connection, it's cut right here, so it's deeply cordate, and that'll be Piper umbellata. Pretty much other than that, the species look identical. So I included that just to not only show this peltate leaf attachment, but just to highlight the fact, much like these pipers, where the minutia might be, that little minuscule detail might be the difference between identifying something to one thing or a completely different thing. Okay, moving on to flowers. So flowers can be a little daunting because there's so much going on. And, you know, my main goal of this portion of the talk is to give names to all these different flower parts, what they're responsible for, and then take those parts and apply them into, you know, real world scenarios to kind of show you that no matter what kind of flower you have, more often than not, you can reduce them to these simple parts because it is a little daunting when you just look at it. So, what is a flower? So, the flower is the reproductive organism of an angiosperm. It includes, often, if it's a bisexual flower, which we'll get into in a moment, it'll include the male portions and the female portions. So we can break that down further. Well, first, let's talk about non-sexual parts. So we've got um, these petals around here, and we've got sepals. So petals and sepals together are going to be referred to as the perianth. Now, I don't typically refer to petals and sepals together, so this is just another example of botanists liking to make up words for the sake of making up words. So we have a group of petals, and they are going to be closer to the central point or the apex of the flower than the sepals are. So petals are on the inside and sepals are on the outside. So a group of petals is going to be called a corolla. And you're going to see that term used, the corolla is 5-parted. The corolla is 4-parted. So that refers to how many petals are within that corolla. And more often than not, I'd say 9 times out of 10, if you have 4 petals, you're going to have 4 sepals. And that group of sepals is called the calyx. And so when a flower develops, you can think of it, as a bud. So you're going to have all the sexy bits in the middle. You're going to have the corolla enveloping them, and then you're going to have the calyx enveloping that. It's almost like protective layers. And then when the flower blooms, it'll open up. These will be on the bottom, and then you'll have the petals, and then you'll have the male and female reproductive sites. So let's go over those reproductive organs real quick. So let's start with female. So the female as a whole, its greater structure is called the gynoecium, or the pistil. Let's call it the pistil because, why use big words when we don't have to? So I remember that as like, okay, a woman holding a pistol is pretty badass, and flowers are definitely badass. So that's the way I remember it. And the pistil can be broken up into 3 general structures: stigma, style, and ovary, going from top to bottom. And the stigma is going to be the location at which the pollen from another flower's male portions will be deposited and stick to. It's usually a sticky surface. And then the style is going to be the structural tube that sticks out and presents that stigma. And then down here you have the ovary, which is where fertilization actually occurs, because this is where the eggs are, or the ovules. And this is where the seed will develop into its fruit, and then you have a fruit site where you used to have a flower a couple weeks before. So we have the pistil, and that is made up of a stigma-style ovary, and it is usually in the center when you have a bisexual flower such as this with both male and female anatomy. So since we're talking about male anatomy, let's go ahead and get into it. So these guys over here are going to be the stamen. And the stamen is this great big structure. If you remember 2 things from this slide, remember pistil and stamen, female and male. The stamen are male because they stay men. They always stay men. That's the way I remember it. I think Justin taught me that. Thanks, buddy. The stamen can be broken down further into the anther and the filament. And the anther is going to be where the pollen is held and developed. So this is the pollen site where everything is kept. And then the filament is just simply a stalk that the anther is held on. So both of these structures are kind of long and stalk-like. Both doing completely different things. This one is giving away pollen to fertilize another plant. This one is receiving pollen to be fertilized and develop into a fruit. So when I said earlier that you could basically take all that information from the previous slide and apply it to most flowers in angiosperms, we have a couple examples here of some flower types that don't really look anything like the previous slide. So These are two flower structures that you should be pretty familiar with, because they both exist in mass quantities up here where we are. So we have composites. So this will be the Asteraceae family, the sunflower family. So you'll have everything from goldenrods to daisies to sunflowers, the Helianthus genus, and many, many, many more. As I said in my first slide, worldwide, the Asteraceae family is the most diverse. In Costa Rica, remember, it's the orchid family. So with composites, you have two different flower types. You have these ray florets, and all of these are individual flowers on the same head. So you have these disc florets on the center. This is the Mexican flame vine, which is an herbaceous vine that we'll see on the property. And then you have, coming off the sides, these, ray flowers. Disc, because it's on the disc. Ray, because it goes out like rays of sunshine. And oftentimes in different species of flowers, or species of plants rather, these flowers will have specific jobs, like they might be receptive to fertilization, or they might be sterile and be attractant to pollinators. Those will all vary based on the species. So down here below we have your typical pea flower. Now peas are a legume, the Fabaceae family. They have 3 different subfamilies. I'm only going to go over this pea subfamily, Faboideae, just because it has a unique flower shape that I kind of want to go over because it's familiar to you guys. So these flowers can be broken down into 3 different parts: the banner, wing, and keel. So we have the banner. This is the top part, these top petals, very showy. And then you have the wings coming out protecting this keel, which encloses all of the reproductive organs. So even though these flowers look completely different than the previous slide, just know that these, whether it be showy parts or different flower structures, they all will have those same reproductive organisms within, or organs within. Flower symmetry is a good way to think about flowers as well. So in my mind, there are 2 basic forms of flower symmetry. For the life of me, I couldn't think of a biradial symmetry one where it's just symmetrical. So if you folded this piece of paper that the flower's on in just 2 ways, it would be symmetrical in only those 2 ways. So for the sake of time and ease, we're going to talk about radial and bilateral, or zygomorphic. So radial meaning that you can take the central point and you can pretty much fold this flower over in more than 2 ways, and they'll overlap each other. They're symmetrical. Another way to think about it is laying a mirror along this axis. And if this image mirrors that image, then you have a radially symmetric flower. So these will include all the sunflowers. This looks to be a monocot. We have flower in numbers of 3. It almost kind of has a spiderwort kind of tradescantia look to it. But this is radially symmetrical, and a lot of flowers are like this. In my opinion, this bilateral or zygomorphic flower it kind of catches your eye a little differently because it is only symmetrical in one plane. So if you were to draw a plane this way, these 2 northern and southern hemispheres would not be reflected equally. Only one way that you can divide this flower and have them be symmetric. So pretty much all orchids will be zygomorphic flowers. You'll have a lot of tubular shaped flowers. Think like mint flowers. Those will be zygomorphic. This is a really cool plant. This is a Columnia species. and they will have zygomorphic flowers. They look like, well, it's actually called the goldfish plant because it kind of looks like a goldfish jumping out of the water. Anyway, it's an epiphytic shrub, meaning it grows in the trees, and it's a really cool plant. Just put it here just because it really well kind of displays that zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetrical form. So real quick, I want to get into these sexual strategies in plants because it is important in certain diagnostic situations, but it also just kind of shows you the diversity within plants and how different plants have, for lack of a better word, pursued different avenues. So does all flowers have male and female reproductive systems? And the answer is no. Do all plants have both female and male flowers on them? The answer is also no. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing in the terminology, but I'm going to break it down slowly, and we're just going to talk about it real quick. I'm not going to hammer these points home real heavily, but let's go over that first question. Does each flower have both male and female parts to it? And the answer is no, as we discussed, and this will come into whether or not a flower is unisexual or bisexual. So as we compare the two, and I'm more of a visual learner, so let's focus on this real quick. So here we have a bisexual flower. It looks very similar to that first diagram we showed with the female parts right here, the pistil, and then we have the stamen with the anthers, the filament and anthers. Those are the male. So it has both. So it is bisexual. It has both sexual parts. Moving over, we have a pistillate flower, which is, it has a pistil. So it is female. Notice that there are no stamens. This does not give off pollen. It only receives it through the female anatomy. So that will be a pistillate flower. It is unisexual. Only has female. Here's another unisexual flower, the staminate. It only has stamen. So it doesn't have that central female anatomy of the pistil. It only has these many stamen coming out of it. So this one gives pollen. It doesn't receive or develop any sort of embryo or seed or fruit. It is just a giver. So going over the definitions, unisexual flowers contains only male or female reproductive organs. So as we just went over, the only male ones are staminate, they stamen. Female, pistillate, they have a pistil. Some examples of this, if you ever grow squash, you know you have both male and female flowers. We went over some aeroid pollination in the previous discussion. Some of them have unisexual flowers. Pines will always have male and female cones. Now they will have both of them on the same plant, but they are still unisexual cones. Alders, you think about the catkins, and then a couple other examples. So I have a little note in here that just says, just note that you may have unisexual flowers, so you might have male separate than female flowers, but you may have both of those flower types on the same plant. And that holds no bearing in this discussion. We're just talking about the individual flowers. So you have a bisexual flower, which we're all familiar with based on the previous slide. The first slide, it has everything. It has both the pistil and the stamen, and they are also called perfect flowers. So we already talked about orchids. We talked about sunflowers as being those composites from the last slide. And the majority of flowers out there are perfect or bisexual flowers. Now that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of types of plants that have unisexual flowers. It's just that most have this bisexual. So continuing with the sexual strategies, we're going to talk about the types of plants being either monoecious or dioecious. So what does that mean? Again, visual learner, so I'm going to go down here and talk about this, this drawing real quick. And on this left side, we have dioecious, which means double house. That means that male flowers are on one plant and only one plant, and female flowers are on one plant and only one plant. Now, there are some specific examples where they may change which ones they produce during different stages of their lives, but for the time being, let's just focus on that. So this double house, you've got two houses separated, two separate organisms, one devoted to male, one devoted to female. So ginkgos are like that. Cecropias, those trees with the mutualistic relationship with the ants, they will either be male or female trees. The catasetum with the sticky Paulownia that I showed you a video of in the last lecture, those were all male flowers coming off of a male plant. In the middle here we have a bisexual plant, which it doesn't matter what type of plant you have, because you have both male and female on each individual flower. So moving over to monoecious plants, which means single house. So you can think of that as both mom and dad or whatever live in one house. Now these are unisexual flowers, meaning this one will just have, presumably blue means boy, I guess. So this one will just have stamens, whereas this one will just have a pistil, but they're on the same plant. And that's indicative of the monoecious plants. And things, all the sedges will have both well, not all, most sedges will have male and female flowers. The flowers are separate, but they're both on the same plant. Same with bananas, apples. If you ever have an apple tree, you know that at each flower site you won't get an apple. You'll only get the apples at the female flower sites. And a bunch of other crops are like that. So monoecious versus dioecious is referring to which male or female does the plant produce. Either dioecious, meaning one or the other, or monoecious, meaning both, either separate like this, and I guess that this is technically a type of monoecious, although it's just a bisexual flower, if that helps simplify things a little bit more. So continuing with the trend of, well, we've got the flower basics, now let's talk about a couple of maybe specialized flowers that might display these basics in a different way because they have different special structures. Starting with orchids. So one thing that makes an orchid is this structure called a column, and that is a structure where the stamen and the pistil have fused together. So you have the Paulownia here, which is the what would be an anther on most flowers. That's the male part that has all the pollen, and then right below that, it's almost like a Paulownia cap that covers up the stigma. You have the stigma, which is the female receptacle leading to the ovary where you will develop seeds. So same but different. You still have a pistil, you still have a stamen, but they fuse together into this column. And another thing that's unique to orchids is this arrangement of their petals and sepals. So one thing that makes an orchid is this this structure called a labellum or a lip. And what it is a modified petal. So counting here, so orchids are monocots, so they will have their petal parts and sepal parts in numbers of 3. You see we have 3 sepals. You have 2 laterals and 1 dorsal, sometimes called a hood, but it's a dorsal sepal, and 1, 2, 3. And then within that, closer to the central portion of the flower, you have 3 petals. You have 2 laterals, and then this labellum, which is a modified petal, often used as kind of a landing pad for would-be pollinators. Here you have, you can see the column, which is this structure. It's just a different view of it. So once we break things down a little bit and explain the anatomy, it seems a little less daunting because, like I said, same but different. All flowers have the same goal in mind, and that's pollination and passing on genes. Here's some lovely examples of some orchids. They're breathtaking, and there are so many species down there. These two Pleurophthalus species are very small. You can see my finger in this one. You need to look really hard to see this Pleurophthalus lewisiae, but you can see the structure. You can see the little labellum, you can see the lateral sepals, the lateral petals, and the dorsum, or the dorsal petal. Similarly, in all these, labellum. This one is an upside down or non-resupinate orchid, like we discussed earlier. So this labellum is up here, and this is the dorsal petal. And then this is just a wonderfully showy flower. It's used to be a vanda. Anyway. Once we break things down, it seems a little bit more digestible. So you can see the column here with the paulownia. Underneath that's the stigma. Here, same thing. Pollinators come in. Everything's kind of pointing towards the landing zone for these pollinators. All about attracting them in. Heliconias are another genus of plant that you'll see a lot of down here at the research station, and you look at them, they're sometimes called lobster claws because these will be bright red, as you'll see in the next slide. But you kind of look at them and you think, well, I know it's a bright showy flower and it's beautiful, but let's break it down a little and we can see what's going on, and maybe it'll become a little bit more familiar. You have the proximal end that's near this rachis coming down, with these bracts that are very showy with the sole purpose of bringing in these pollinators. And then within that, you have your stigma coming in within this petal, leading down to the ovary where fertilization happens. Another cool thing to think about with these flowers is think about what pollinates them. What's going to be able to get in there? Hummingbirds are the main culprit for these guys. Some moths could get in there with their long proboscis or whatever you call it. I forget. I might have just used the wrong term. I'm not sure. But once we break things down a little bit, it's a little bit more familiar, a little bit more digestible, and the fruit will arise from this ovary. You can see that the petals and the sepals here and then in here are not the showy parts. It'll be this bract that comes off of the rachis, and it's very showy, meant to attract things, meant to be a little perch. Heliconias come in two varieties, each with a bunch of species within them. You'll have these pendulate ones, meaning they hang like the pendulum of a clock. This is not upside down, it's just hanging down. And then you'll have the more erect ones. And those are, again, you can look at it real quick and cut half of your options off the table because, oh, well, I know that this one's erect or this one's a pendulate one. And you can go from there. So here's a couple examples of heliconias. You've got one erect one here. This is going to be a cultivar growing in the butterfly garden. Very beautiful. You've got these showy bracts that are meant to attract pollinators in, and within that you have all the reproductive organisms. The rest are going to be pendulant. This one's very hairy. That's something to mark down in your notes. We've got yellow petals and sepals. That's another diagnostic characteristic of these. As you go into it, you get towards the ovary, and then, up here is going to be where that stigma is to receive the pollen and all that. This is the main species that we see of heliconia on the property, and this is Heliconia pogonantha. It's it's dominant in the understories of these Caribbean slope lowlands, and it's breathtaking. So you can see that not only is it a pendulant flower structure, but it's also spiraling. It's very beautiful, and within each of these floral bracts that you see, you have all the flowers' internal systems. The petals and sepals I've actually peeled away from this one so that you can just see the pistil going down towards the ovary where fertilization occurs. I included this slide just because I really like it a lot, because I couldn't find a better talking point on it other than it shows plant groupings. So what you see here is an order. So we talked about genus and species being the lowest description of how you can describe an organism. Above that is family, and then above that is order. So each of these plants represents a family, and you can see these common characteristics within these Zingiberales, which is known as the ginger order. So, and for its namesake, this is going to be a ginger plant in the Zingiberaceae family. You'll see plenty of these grown ornamentally as they most of the species in that family is native to Southeast Asia. There are some in the neotropics, but they like to plant them around the research station and use the roots as food. But we have some common traits here. We have these mucoid leaves, these paddle-shaped leaves. There are some similarities in the reproductive systems, but I just thought it was a really cool illustration of, okay, the plant world is so diverse and it's so overwhelming, but if we take it in bite-sized chunks, maybe we can digest it a little easier and realize that, oh, well, we've got these heliconias and we have gingers, we have these prayer plants. They all have these common traits, bird of paradise, bananas, and they're all within their particular family based off shared traits, and then you can go further with that into genus and species. Just have a couple more examples of flowers that you'll run into, and just kind of break it down based off of what we know already. Breathtaking hibiscus that you'll see. We can see that this is a radially symmetrical flower. It can be divided on multiple planes. It is a bisexual flower because it has the central pistil here, and these, believe it or not, are going to be the stamen. That's a characteristic of this family, the Malvaceae family, is that they will have anthers fused to a central pistil. And here you have the stigma where it receives pollen. Beautiful flower. See it on a lot of board shorts. Here you have that columnia that we were talking about, zygomorphic. It's only symmetrical on one plane, and in here you can see stigmas with a longer pistil, and that's where it receives pollen, and these guys give away pollen. Here we have Mucunia, which is it's in the legume family, which it doesn't really look like a flower, but then think about clovers. Think about what a clover flower looks like, not the whole head, but the individual flowers. So they'll be in that same subfamily, and the reproductive organs are in the middle. We have another member of the legume family with more of this powder puff kind of what do you call it? Flower structure, where each one of these is an individual flower. It kind of resembles that mimosa, and that's the subfamily it's in. Here we have a Psychotria, or Palicoria, as its name is changed. This one is going to be a sore mouth plant, and I bring this up because I can't remember if I talked about it in the last lecture, but there's that hot lips plant. They're both in the same genus, and the one difference is these involucral bracts here these red leafy-like structures that are adapted not as part of the flower, but rather at the base of the flower, meant to attract pollinators. The ones on these ones, the tomentose sore mouth plant, are hairy. You can see the sheen of those hairs along the margin where the light's reflected, whereas the hot lips plant, these involucral bracts, will be smooth or glabrous. Just kind of hammering that point home where, hey, even a hairy versus non-hairy can be the difference in a species. So here we have the actual flower, these little five-parted, little tubular flowers within which are both the male and female reproductive organs. We talked in pretty good detail last time about aroid flower structures, so I'm just going to gloss over it real quick. So we have this central spadix covered by this leafy spathe, which is a familial trait for the Araceae family, with, in this diagram, female flowers below male flowers in this sterile lipid-rich zone that we talked about. Now, in this, which is a peace lily, a spathiphyllum, Frigixthalii, and then also in this anthurium, you can see that all these flowers look alike. Now, in these two genera, each flower will be a bisexual flower. So you can see these are all ripening into a fruit, and you can only ripen into a fruit if you have a female portion. So all these flowers are bisexual, just to show a little deviation from this guy, which, you know, talks about the different zones. These guys don't adhere to that. This is all a bisexual mass of different flowers. I think that's all I wanted to talk about the Araceae, but if you see this spadix and spathe with these big broad leaves, and you've got an aroid on your hands. So passion flowers, I just kind of wanted to throw this in to just blow everyone's minds because they look like little spaceships. But if we break them down based on the information that we've learned, we can kind of tell what's going on here. So we've got these stamen down below. These will be the pads that carry the pollen. We've got a superior ovary right here that receives pollen through these stigmas. 1, 2, 3 up here. The style leads to the ovary and fertilization occurs. Now these are awesome flowers with a lot more stuff going on that I'll save for another time, but it's one of those examples where you look at it and you're like, I don't even know what's going on, but once you break it down based off some terminology we've learned, it seems a little bit less intimidating and a little bit more digestible. So we're almost done. Thanks for your attention. Just going to go over a couple, putting all the puzzle pieces together aspects. Pay attention to where hairs are. If the plant's hairy, if it's not, what kind of hairs, where they're at. So here we have the stem of this member of the melastome family. It's very hairy. That could be important when we're keying it out. I already talked about this Polychoria tomentosa and how it differs from Polychoria elata, the hot lips plant, because these bracts are going to be hairy on this individual and smooth on the other, just highlighting the portion that sometimes it's just one little detail that separates two species from each other. And this beautiful Columnia is I included it in here just because it's so hairy, and sometimes these diagnostic characteristics will jump right out at you. And these to mix in some other vocabulary, these are axillary flowers. They're not born on the terminus of the stalk. They're born at each of these node sites. So these will actually be some bracts that cover up the petals and sepals, which you can see right here. So sometimes the showy part of the plant, like in this individual and in this individual, isn't even part of the flower. It's an adapted feature that can attract pollinators towards the flower. So hairs are important. Another diagnostic feature you might run into, hopefully not actually run into, haha, it's getting late, spines. So I know we actually talked about some of these in our last lecture, but we have the prop root of the walking palm, this Socratia. This guy might look familiar because it is a species of greenbrier. It's got an actually boxy stem. That's a diagnostic characteristic of this particular species, something to make note of. But you can tell, it's got thorns, and that's something you're going to write down if you're trying to describe a species. These guys, both in that nettle family that we talked about earlier, that might sting you a little bit. So definitely be on the lookout and don't inspect those spines too closely. Even great big trees. This tree I documented several years ago. It probably was, if you guys are familiar with DBH or diameter at breast height, this thing was probably 20 inches at breast height. So it's a immature, becoming mature tree in this Ceiba genus, and with age it will eventually lose these thorns. But thorns is a good diagnostic characteristic to make note of when you're identifying something. Still putting the puzzle pieces together. We already talked about venation, but just hammering it home. These two are members of that melastome family. It's got this subparallel leaf venation with these ladder veins coming in and intersecting, going towards the midrib. That's a diagnostic characteristic of this particular family. Here we have a margin that's pretty toothy. I would call it serrate. These spines, in this particular case, are pretty stiff. So that's going to be something you make note of. This philodendron here, there's plenty of philodendrons down on the property, but this grandipes is pretty uniquely kind of furrowed almost. Like there's almost a texture to it. But you can see that these are not netted veins, they're parallel veins, parallel to one another, that is. So just to kind of put the puzzle pieces together for you guys, this is that zamia that we talked about earlier. It's actually that cone-bearing plant with naked seeds, a gymnocarp. So you can see how venation could be a diagnostic characteristic when you're figuring something out. And look at roots if you got them. Again, we're going to talk about this walking palm real quick. You're going to become real familiar with that. You're not going to have trouble IDing that. That one's helpful for you. We talked about velamen on these roots for a lot of epiphytic orchids. Usually there's not anything about the velamen that you can ID an orchid by, but if you see something vegetatively, maybe without this beautiful epidendrum flower on it, and you see it and you're like, man, what is it? I know it's an epiphyte, but oh, I remember the velamen spiel that Aaron gave about those hollow dead cells that suck up moisture. We talked about buttressing roots in the previous discussion. A lot of times these root buttresses can guide you into what species it is, because not all trees, number one, will get this big, but number two, not all of them will buttress out with age. One thing I'd like to hammer home to you guys is if you are describing something or trying to key something out, take lots of measurements. A lot of times if you have something that you're unsure about, if you took some measurements, whether it be on the spadix of this piper or the leaf width, you might be able to tell something. If you get down to your key and you're between 4 species, say, but you don't have a particular diagnostic characteristic in your hand or in your photos because you're back in Maryland trying to kill time during the winter IDing stuff. A lot of times you can go back to your measurements that you took and say, oh, well, I know it might be this because of the leaf width or because of the flower length. I will say, if you're trying to do botany in Costa Rica, when you're taking measurements, use that metric system, because all your literature is going to be in metrics. You can forget about that inches nonsense. But just like when you come across a mammal track in the mud, or you're looking at anything else, taking measurements is a really good idea. And I'd like for you guys to, if you don't have a ruler yourself, maybe make sure that everybody or one person in your group has one before you go out. I'm not sure how much experience you guys have with these keys, but this is just to familiarize yourself real quick. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but maybe get familiar with how a dichotomous key works, because this is how you're going to figure things out, whether they be plants or frogs or whatever. It's not always as simple as, oh, well, one is red and one is blue. Sometimes you have to look at these things and say, oh, well, is the ovary superior or is it inferior, meaning that the connection point is above or below the corolla. And if you know these things, great. If you don't know them, you have a glossary to look it up, and then you can go through your steps. And this is where all that vocabulary that we went over comes into handy, because you don't necessarily want to flip to the back of your book so many times. So it's a slow process of learning all this stuff, but it's definitely a worthwhile one with your career in the future if you choose to take one up. Just another quick example, these are the pipers, those Piper ACE that we were talking about earlier. Leaves palmately nerved. So we talked about compound versus simple leaves. Well, just take that vocabulary and apply to it the nerves of the plant, the veins, and is it palmate or pinnate? Go to 2 or go to 16. Go to 2. Leaves gibbous or very unequal at base. We kind of talked about that unequal at base thing with those leaf pictures that we had earlier. So this is just a quick example of what you will find in a dichotomous key. And maybe warm up to the idea of using them in the future. They can be really helpful, they can be really confusing, but practice makes perfect. So bringing it all back together, what do I look at first with a plant? Now that we've gone over this stuff, it shouldn't seem as unfamiliar. So I've got this diagram in front of us. Personally, I'm noticing right off the bat that it's an opposite leaf plant. I'm noticing that the flower type is this composite, so I know it's in the Asteraceae family. And then I'm noticing little hairs on the leaves, and I'm noticing that the leaf is serrate along the margins. I'm noticing that also it has growth not only terminally, but on the axillary buds. These are going to develop into flowers. And now I'm going to look in my book rather than just noticing one thing. Okay, it's opposite. Let me look through my book. Oh, it's a composite. Let me look at my book. Well, if I notice 3 or 4 things and then I go to my book, I can filter out things a little bit more quickly. And a couple other things that I included in here, now that we talked about all this stuff, is other things to consider is, well, what season am I in? Am I looking for a flower, or am I looking for a fruit? Is it blooming in July or is it blooming in September? A lot of those can whittle your options down quite significantly. We talked about the leaf and stem surfaces. We have a whole bunch of vocabulary at our disposal to describe them now. We touched on perennial versus annual. That involves usually looking at the roots. A lot of times you have to sacrifice a plant to do that, which I'm not suggesting anybody do that in Costa Rica, just because there can be harmful alkaloids and stuff in some of these plants. But we'll talk about that during our safety talk. But yeah, just wanted this before and after kind of screenshot of, now that we've talked about all this stuff, what am I looking at? what am I looking at and what am I noticing first. And hopefully a lot of this stuff is just a little bit more digestible to you guys than it was a couple hours ago. I'm sorry for going so long. I'm new at this if you haven't noticed. But I like plants, so it's fun to talk about, so I kind of lose track of time. But just wrapping things up here, thanks so much for your attention, guys. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments or specific questions, feel free to shoot me an email if you feel the need to. Otherwise, wait until the trip. That's fine too. I like this kind of stuff, so I like talking about it. So if you do have a question, feel free to reach out. If not, that's cool too. I'm excited for the trip. I hope you guys are too. I know frogs and snakes are way cooler than plants, but I hope that you appreciate plants just a tiny bit more after these talks. But if you don't, my feelings aren't hurt. So have fun. Once again, thanks for your attention. Have a good evening or morning or whenever it is.